Okay, so, I don't know about you guys, but I think that the story that we have just read is one of the most fascinating ones in Torah. In less than half a chapter, it packs in a huge amount of deep, deep spiritual instruction. This story tells us a lot about what it means to be a Jew and to live Jewishly. So let's recap quickly what happens in the story. First, God says to Abraham that he's heard a lot of bad things about the goings-on in Sodom and Gomorrah. Interestingly, just before the verses we started with this morning, God has a little debate with himself about whether or not to let Abraham know what he's planning to do. There are a lot of other great things going on in the verses that we did read, so I'm not going to dwell on that aspect, but I will come back to it briefly in just a minute. So Abraham hears what God's planning, and he decides that he really needs to speak up. Abraham asks God, are you really going to wipe out the innocent and the guilty? What if there are 50 innocent people there? God agrees that he wouldn't wipe out the whole place if there are 50 innocent people. And from that point, Abraham negotiates with God to get him down to 45, and then 40, and so forth, all the way down to 10 innocent people. So, what's this story meant to teach us? One obvious thing is that this is the proof text for the halakhic requirement that it takes 10 or more Jews to make a minyan. While it's interesting to know where the rabbinic laws come from, I honestly find the spiritual instruction in Torah to be much juicier stuff. For example, God says that he's going to go down to Sodom to see whether things are as bad as he's heard. I find this very intriguing. Our understanding of God, as taught to us by Maimonides, is that God is not only everywhere, but he's perfect, unchanging, and all-knowing. So if God knows everything that ever was, is, and will be, why would he have to go down anywhere to find out what's going on? Obviously, the person who first wrote this story down didn't think like Maimonides. According to our Parsha, God sometimes needs to get up and go take a look and check things out for himself. Notice, too, in verse 17, that God asks himself whether he should hide what he is about to do from Abraham. However, during the conversation that Abraham has with God, it looks like that whole plan is actually totally up in the air. And that doesn't sound much like an unchanging God to me. Somewhere along the line, our tradition's understanding of the nature of God has changed. Let's just put that on the shelf for a few minutes. Here's another really intriguing thing. It might seem like Abraham has a lot of chutzpah to challenge God like this. Abraham says, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Wow. That really sounds like fighting words to me. However, let's look more closely at what Abraham also says and how he says it. While negotiating down from 50 to 10, Abraham says things like, here I venture to speak to my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes, and let not my Lord be angry if I go on, and ultimately, just this one last time. So Abraham may be challenging God, but he's doing it in an overtly deferential way. Clearly, Abraham never forgets who's in charge. So what is Torah teaching us here about what it means to be a Jew? Abraham isn't just a patriarch. He's the patriarch, the first Jew, the one with whom God has made a covenant that we all live by to this day. In the Amidah, we pray that God will redeem us on account of the loyalty of Abraham and of the other patriarchs and matriarchs. Clearly, Abraham is meant to be a role model for us. What kind of behavior does Abraham model? He understands that God is in charge, that's for sure. And at the same time, though, Abraham understands two other really important things. First, that we as God's children have an important part to play in God's plan for the world. We aren't here to just keep quiet and listen up. We have an important role to play in making the world a better place. The Adonai of our Parsha is not all-knowing. He doesn't know the future, because the future won't be made until we all use the free will that God has given us to make our choice to either help or hinder God's plan. One might easily think that the dutiful thing for Abraham to do would have been to say, quite right, Adonai, those guys really had it coming. But that isn't what Abraham does at all. Rather, he uses his free will to dutifully point out that justice needs to be tempered by compassion and that righteousness needs to be preserved and encouraged. Second, and even more importantly, Abraham is pointing out to us that right is right, even for God. In Abraham's day, the idea that there would be only one set of rules and that these rules would apply equally to regular folks, to kings, and even to God, well, that was just crazy talk. Everybody back then knew that the more important and powerful you were, the more you mattered and the more you could get away with. By the time that Moses and the Israelites had made it to Mount Sinai, everyone in the Middle East would have been very familiar with the law codes of Hammurabi. This was the written law of Babylon at the time, and it made it very clear that if you were in charge, you could literally get away with murder. For Abraham, the first Jew, this well-established principle, upheld by everyone across what was then the known world, was just plain wrong. I suggested a minute ago that this story about Abraham has a lot to teach us about what it means to be Jews and to live Jewishly. So what is it that makes this story about a guy that lived 3,700 years ago and over 9,000 kilometers away so important to us here and now? Well, let's consider again the way our role model Abraham behaved. First, he understood that as Jews we have an important, active role to play in God's plan for the world. Second, Abraham understood that our importance to God doesn't give us license to get too full of ourselves. Nevertheless, we can't ignore our obligation to actively bring justice and compassion into the world. Third, Abraham reminds us that right and wrong don't depend on who you are, and especially not on how important or powerful you are. For some Jews, living Jewishly means studying and living by a long list of rules. For Abraham, living Jewishly meant standing up for what's right, even if that means challenging, in the most deferential of ways, of course, God himself. A month from now, we're going to read about how Abraham's own grandson, Jacob, was renamed Israel, the one who wrestles with God. And here we are, the children of Israel. It's our heritage not to follow blindly, but to continue to wrestle with God, striving to discern our own parts in God's plan for the world. This is why, in particular, I'm proud to be a Reformed Jew. Our movement, more than any other, is the one that strives to reconsider and reapply the moral principles of our ancient scriptures to the new challenges of modern times. Abraham wouldn't ever have been able to conceive of or understand organ transplants, reproductive technologies, or whether or not it's acceptable to patent man-made genetic materials, but he would certainly understand and approve of our movement's ongoing commitment to considering these modern issues in the light of our ancient moral teachings. So we, as modern liberal Jews, should follow in our father Abraham's footsteps and continue to struggle boldly and deferentially with God's teaching for us, always searching for ways to grow and apply our ancient moral principles to the new challenges of our modern lives, looking for ways to use our God-given free will to bring justice and compassion into the world.